Okay, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to give this talk at this moment in time. And of course, I would have loved to be there in person, but I hope we can do that at a future point in time. So just to give you just two references, this talk is going to be based on a working paper that I released a few weeks ago on equilibrium social distancing. And towards the end of the talk, I'm also going to talk about an extension of this work that I've been working on day and night, which is basically the extension of the model I'm going to present today to a world with asymptomatic infection, that is in a world where people are not sure about whether they're infected or not. So just to give you a little bit of background, we are currently facing a very serious global crisis, namely the COVID-19 epidemic. And it is a crisis not just in the standard dimension of being a health crisis, because of the series of measures that we've been having to implement to combat the disease, it has also turned into an economic and a social crisis. And it is thus one that threatens both our health and our livelihoods. Now, one thing that is that at this point distinguishes the COVID-19 epidemic from other epidemics is that we still don't have any pharmaceutical interventions to try to stop the spread of the disease. So in particular, we don't have antiviral drugs. For some infectious diseases, we have antivirals such as Tamiflu. And what they do is basically they speed up the rate of recovery, and therefore it can be used as a control measure. And similarly, we still don't have vaccines at our disposal. So just as a plug for a paper that will be coming out soon with my co-author, we are going to look at these kinds of interventions in a different context, but it's a different set of questions to the ones I'm going to be talking about today. So at present, there are no pharmaceutical interventions, and therefore really what we have to rely on is what is called NPIs, or behavioral or non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as social distancing. So social distancing now encompasses a lot of different interventions, but the traditional ones are quarantines, where you close off neighborhoods or countries, and you don't allow people to go in and out of those neighborhoods. Self-isolation, which we're all currently practicing, but also, of course, closure of schools, workplaces, and what have you. So these are kind of the interventions we have at our disposal today. And what those interventions have in common is really that they work through the contact rate of individuals. They basically break the meetings of individuals, and by doing so, it is hoped it allows us to basically slow down the disease and hope that some kind of immunity builds up over time that can protect the rest of the population until, that is, we have other measures such as vaccines. So in a historical perspective, of course, this is nothing new. I found some nice examples here. This is the plague in Florence, and there's a very nice quote here by Boccaccio, that the Black Death made people shun and flee from the sick. And by doing so, everybody thought, of course, that they could, save themselves from the infection. Actually, the Decameron itself took place in a context where the people that were fleeing the Black Death were actually telling stories to each other. I found a nice one here about the Great Plague of Milan, given where you are right now. So this was a later epidemic, and this is a picture of the townspeople trying to get away from the disease. This particular epidemic claimed about 60,000 lives out of a population of 130,000. So roughly half of the population perished on that occasion. And I think it's kind of interesting to note that some of the passengers here seem to be death itself. So it seems from the artist's perspective, it was not clear that the people fleeing the death actually were aware of whether they were asymptomatically infected and therefore marked for eventual demise. So more recently, of course, we have much more precise idea about social distancing. I couldn't find Milan, so here I have Lombardy, but you can see that on many of these measures, these are community mobility reports by Google that shows where people are relative to where they normally are at that time of the year. And you can see that retail and recreation, activity in parks, and so on are much, much lower than they are relative to the baseline, whereas staying at home has increased significantly. So these are all just different ways in which we can see that people are actually changing behavior in order to avoid being infected. So in a sense, social distancing is very much about behavior, it's about decision-making of individuals. And since it is a choice, we can then ask the question, well, if it is a choice to make, to socially distance yourself, what are the ingredients that go into this decision-making process of individuals? What is it that changes their behavior, and how can we understand that in a kind of a fully fledged economic paradigm? So this is what I'm going to do today. I'm going to basically show you a very simple economic model of social distancing, which is going to be able to inform behavior in an epidemic. And in doing so, I will be drawing on the standard tools of game theory and economics that we're all familiar with, but which so far have not really made inroads, very strong inroads into the epidemiology literature. So I don't want to spend too much time on background literature, but I think I do owe existing authors to just mention there is an existing literature on social distancing. It goes all the way back to the 1970s, but I think in the last 10 years has been much more active than earlier, and I just put them there, and they're all referenced in the paper. More recently, there's been a new wave of interest in these issues, most of them within the macro literature, and most of them have taken a non-behavioral approach in that they look at social planners' problem, but so far most of the papers have not looked at individual decision-making at the micro level. But I'm sure this is just a matter of time before that is going to appear. Okay, so just give you a very brief preview of the findings. I'm going to show that the incentives of individuals to socially distance, or that is to reduce their exposure to infection, is going to depend on the costs of distancing. So I'm going to model that there's some kind of discomfort associated with not exposing yourself to infection, and on the other hand, the perceived risks involved in exposing yourself. So there's going to be very clear trade-off between social distancing and the risks of infection. What is going to happen is that the decision to socially distance oneself is going to depend in a very straightforward manner on the risks of infection, and in particular, when the risks are very low, which would typically be the case at very early stages of the epidemic, because there are not many people infected. In those situations, people are not going to socially distance themselves. They're going to go about their everyday business as if nothing had happened. And similarly, towards the end of the epidemic, where people are no longer really at risk, again, they will cease social distancing and they will return to normal activities. Now, in the intermediate region, that is around the peak of the epidemic, well, there it's going to happen that the risks involved in exposure are going to be intolerable from the perspective of individuals, and therefore they will spontaneously start reducing their exposure and so socially distance themselves. Now, the upshot of that is that overall, the equilibrium social distancing behavior of individuals is going to help to dampen the extent of the disease, rather than having a very marked peak like we see in the standard epidemiological models. What we're going to have is that optimal, or rather privately optimal decision-making is going to work in the other direction, and therefore is going to not allow the disease to spread as much as it otherwise would have. And that turns out to have other consequences on the time series properties of the disease that I will be more explicit about when I get to them. And in some sense, the worse the epidemic gets, the more people protect themselves, and in some sense, that helps to make the outbreak less severe than might have been predicted based on a purely mathematical epidemiology model. So the analysis is going to have basically two components. I'm going to very briefly go through the biological model.
Fabio, just one question. I mean, here when you say that people protect themselves, I mean, you already alluded to that there are two ways to protect yourself, no, from a selfish point of view, which is just remaining at home or just escaping, no, the situation. Eh?
Yeah.
And of course, the implications are very different, no. The latter will tend to spread the disease, no.
So in my model, there's going to be, you're going to see exactly how I model it. So I'm not going to have a spatial model where people can escape. This is one of the things that I'm looking at in different work now, where there's a geographical dimension where you can maybe go to another location. So that I'm not going to have that in this model. In this model, you'll see there's a very, very, very straightforward way of modeling that. So maybe I should take that question when we come back to that, if that's all right.
Sure,
okay.
sure.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to first sketch the epidemiological model, and then I'm going to basically build on top of that the economic model, which is going to basically give us the behavior that we can use then to analyze the interplay between decisions at the microscopic level, that is each individual decision maker, and the aggregate evolution in the population at the macro level. And of course, this kind of interplay between the micro behavior and the aggregate quantities, this is something that economists are very comfortable with, because this is exactly the kind of interactions we do in macroeconomics every day. So, so that's basically the idea. Okay, so let me just spend 2 slides on the epidemiological model, which I assume you will all have seen by now. But basically, it's going to be a compartmental model. It's going to be 3 health states for a given individual, namely susceptible, infected, or recovered. And once we have written down the model this way, there's a lot of inbuilt assumptions. In particular, we assume that there's going to be no births and deaths, there's going to be no recovery to susceptibility, and so forth. So basically, what's going to happen is that susceptible people are going to be meeting infected people, and those meetings are going to create a flow from the susceptible into the infected. And once that has happened, then the infected people are going to be recovering at some rate, which I'm going to call gamma, and they are going to go back down here to the recovered. Now, the recovered people in this basic model are assumed to be immune to further infection, and that will turn out to be important for understanding the dynamics of the model. So mathematically, this system is described by a set of differential equations like this. So let me just talk you through the first 3 of them. The first one tells us how does the change in the set of susceptible people, how is the change at a given point in time? Well, there's going to be I times S meetings between susceptible and infected people, and those are going to translate into infection at a rate beta. And because there's a minus here, this denotes an outflow from susceptibles. And you will see that I times beta times S reappears in the equation for these infected people. That's basically those people that reappear here, but also infected people recover at a rate gamma, and those are the people that we'll find in the 3rd equation. So this is basically the dynamic system in the SIR model. The other ones are basically initial conditions, and here it just tells us we're normalizing the size of the population to 1 for simplicity.
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Sorry, yeah. Are there no deaths here?
No, there are no deaths, but this is a straightforward change that I will discuss at the end. So there are 2 kinds of deaths that one can contemplate. There's one that is natural deaths. In that case, you have an outflow from each of these compartments, S, I, and R. You basically have minus mu times S in the first one, minus mu times I in the second one, and minus mu times R in the third one. And then you can have disease-induced mortality, which is basically to have a minus delta in here that shows that people who are infected, they leave the system at a rate delta. So that's pretty straightforward. It just has an extra parameter that floats around. And also what happens then is that the population size is no longer equal to 1 at all times. And so we can't interpret these as fractions. We have to reinterpret them as measures. But that's all. I'll tell you later how that would change the dynamics. It's basically a change of payoffs. Okay? Okay. So the SIR dynamics, they look like that. As you would expect, the number of susceptible people decreases over time. The number of recovered people increases over time. This is not surprising because you can't become susceptible again, so therefore it must empty out over time. And similarly, once you're recovered, that's an absorbing state, so therefore that must increase over time. Now, the thing that is interesting here is that the number of infected people, it increases, it then peaks at some level called the peak prevalence, and then the number of people disappears, sorry, the number of affected people, it vanishes over time. So that means that even in the biological model, even without any social distancing from anyone, eventually the infectious disease will die out. So when we're looking at behavior, we're not really necessarily looking at what happens with the infinite horizon number of infected people, because in these models, typically that would be zero. Is basically trying to see how the decisions of individuals changes the time path of the infection in order to for people to, of course, to maximize their utility. But I'm running ahead of myself. So one thing that I want to take away from this point is that the biological model implicitly assumes that even though the risks of infection for a given individual are non-monotone in the biological model, they don't actually change behavior. That is, at the very early stages or close to the peak of the epidemic, people behave in exactly the same manner. And this, of course, is something we would like to dig deeper into and try to see whether that makes sense. Okay. So let's go to the economic model. The economic model is going to be very, very simple. I'm going to introduce payoffs, and I'm going to call those pi I, pi S, and pi R. And those basically stand for flow utilities that individuals experience at each moment in time, depending on their health state. And what I'm going to assume, which is quite natural, is that when you're susceptible, your well-being is higher than when you're infected. So that explains why pi S is larger than pi I. We also assume that pi I is lower than pi R. So, and pi R is going to be lower than pi S. So the first inequality here basically allows me to model the possibility of after effects. So you may recover from infection, but you may have permanent disabilities because you were infected. For example, we know that COVID-19 causes quite a lot of lung damage. So you might no longer be infected, but you might have actually things that you carry forward even though you have recovered. So these three payoff levels basically gives us a motive for an individual to try to avoid becoming infected. I'm also going to assume that people are going to discount the future at some rate rho, because we're going to have a dynamic program here, or a dynamic optimization problem. So now let's move to the social distancing choice. So the way I've chosen to model this is I'm going to allow people to scale back their level of exposure. So each individual I is going to non-cooperatively choose at each point in time an exposure level epsilon I, which takes values in 0, 1. And what that's going to do, it is going to modify the probability of becoming infected for that given individual. So that means that the personal infection rate is going to be epsilon I times beta times I. And so basically you can think of beta I as being, the probability of meeting an infected individual times the riskiness of that encounter, that's the beta. But then I can modify that by basically choosing how much I want to expose myself. So epsilon equal to 1 would basically take us back to the standard biological model in which there's no behavior, whereas epsilon equal to 0 is a situation where you basically stay at home. You don't expose yourself at all to the infection. So this is going to basically be how I am going to model the social distancing choice. Now, because I don't want everybody to socially distance at all times, I'm going to make it costly to socially distance. And the way I've done that is by assuming that it's going to be costs involved in social distancing. And that is basically a parameter C times 1 minus your epsilon. So that means, for example, that if you choose to fully socially distance, that is, you choose epsilon equal to 0, then, is equal to 1, then you actually pay a cost. Whereas if you don't, if you choose full exposure, then you don't have any cost involved. And I know that some people like it more this way around. You can recast the entire model in terms of a distancing choice, D, and then D is just 1 minus epsilon. So you can think of D as the distancing choice, which is just the inverse of the exposure choice. but mathematically is completely the same thing. Okay, good. So the trade-off basically for each individual is whether or not to increase your exposure level. Exposure is pleasant because it avoids the costs of social distancing, but on the other hand, of course, it increases your probability of infection, which means that it hastens the switch from susceptibility to infection, which of course decreases your payoffs. And so I just want to emphasize that this is not a decision problem, it is actually a game. And the reason is that in the infection probability of the individual, you have capital I of t, and capital I of t, of course, is something that is determined at the aggregate, and therefore it's a function of what other people in the population are doing. So when people make decisions, it's going to change the aggregate variables, which in turn is going to influence the decision problem of the individual. So just to show you schematically the timeline of transitions, you begin being susceptible, you're earning pi s per instant. At some point, there's going to be a shift to being infected. And at that point, of course, your payoff shifts to pi I. Now, this transition from susceptibility to infection is governed by a Poisson process, a Poisson distribution with rate epsilon beta I. So this is one you choose yourself. But once you have become infected, you then recover, and that recovery date is also Poisson distributed with a rate gamma. So this is going to be exogenous from the perspective of the individual. So the problem of the individual is going to be.
Fabio, just a question.
Yeah.
Does it follow from how you're explaining things that once infected, if one was to revise their epsilon?
Once you're in my model,
it will go to 1.
Yes. So in my model, whenever you're not susceptible, your dominant strategy is to always expose yourself fully. The only reason you would want to change your exposure in this model is to avoid the risk of infection. Once you're infected or susceptible or recovered, you no longer socially distance yourself in this model. So people are not, in any case, sense altruistic here. The only thing they care about is their own personal infection risk or that of their household. Okay.
Okay. No, it's a reasonable start model to consider, but of course in the real world,
of course, yes. That's true. There's no problem here in throwing in a small weight on other people's welfare, but this is the benchmark that I'm looking at now for sure. Yeah. Okay. So let me just show you very quickly. I don't want to belabor the point very much, but the maximization problem of the individual is basically you're maximizing your infinite horizon discounted expected utility. So this thing is basically your discounting term. Then there's going to be some state variable I call P, and you can think of that as the probability of density of transition. And you can see that when P becomes 1, that is, you have already switched to becoming infected, you will then receive a value function, VI, and VI is basically the net present value of having just entered into the infected state. So if you go back to this is basically VI is what you receive once you go right in here. So with some time, some random amount of time, you're going to be earning that, and then after that, you're going to earn that, and of course, that's going to be suitably discounted. So that's what this VI expression does. Then, when P is equal to 0, that is, you haven't been infected yet, what you're maximizing is basically you're earning pi s at this moment in time, but you're also expending some costs on social distancing. And if you look at the constraint down here, the differential equation basically keeps track of how that rate of change is influenced by your own decision on social distancing. So this is basically the maximization problem. And it turns out that the simplicity of the model gives us a very sharp characterization of the best responses. So the best responses is, it looks like a bang-bang, but in fact is what is called a bang singular. And I will explain exactly what that means on the next slide. So so what is happening here is that the individual choice of person number I is going to take 3 possible values. When infection is relatively lower than some critical threshold I star, which is given by this expression, then the privately optimal thing for the individual is to choose full exposure. So what that means is basically no social distancing for low levels of infection. Similarly, for very high levels of infection above this critical threshold, the opposite is true. You would choose no exposure whatsoever because it is just too risky for you. And in the knife's edge case, where I is equal to I star, it turns out there that individuals are indifferent between all their strategies, and therefore any old epsilon will do. It turns out that this epsilon is not just an aberration. It turns out that whenever social distancing will take place, we will be in this knife's edge case. And I will explain that now. So basically, on the equilibrium path, we will never have epsilon equal to 0. We will either be in the first case, where full exposure, or in the intermediate case, where people randomize between strategies. And the way to understand it is in terms of this diagram. So this basically shows you from 0 up to 1, the level of disease prevalence in the population. And here, with the dotted line, I've shown you the case I star. So remember, according to the best response function, when you start out in this disease, you start at 0. This is the beginning of the world. And infection, because down here people don't protect themselves, what happens is that more and more people have to become infected. Okay, because of the parameters of the model, this is what's going to happen. So whenever we are below I star, nobody's going to protect themselves, and therefore infection is going to increase. What happens then is that at some point we're going to reach the critical threshold I star. At that point, the best response of individuals switches away from E equal to 1. That is, we are no longer going to have full exposure. Now, let me explain to you why we can never end up in this region on the equilibrium path. The reason we can't end up here is that in order to have ended up here in the first place, the only way this could have happened, starting from below, is if once we reach the threshold I star, people still chose full exposure. And that's the only way we can actually move above this level. So let me just repeat that. When you start from a low level of infection, if you ever were to go above this level, the only way that could have happened is that people fully exposed themselves or exposed themselves too much according to their best response function. So what would happen as soon as you move up here is that people would stop exposing themselves completely, and therefore it would move down to this level epsilon. So what happens is that if this were not an SIR model, but an SIS model where people can be susceptible again, and I have that in a different paper, then this would basically have been the steady state of the system. When you start below the steady state, you go up. When you start above the steady state, you go down. The peculiarity about the SIR model is that the steady state has I equal to 0. So therefore, this is just a temporary regime in the SIR model, whereas in the SIS model, you would have been stuck here forever. Now,
sorry, can I ask you a clarification?
Yeah.
This passage from 1 to basically to epsilon or 0,
yeah.
This abrupt manner, does this depend on the linearity of the cost?
Yes.
Yes, no? Because
Yes.
in principle, you would not expect this. You would expect a much more gradual type of...
Absolutely. So this is pretty straightforward. The only thing that is really important here is the monotonicity. So what happens in the nonlinear cost case is that you're going to phase in the social distancing slowly, and then you're going to reach a level equivalent to I star, but not quite I star, at which you're going to hover around that point. So I'm going to talk about what are the robust conclusions later, if I may.
Okay.
Okay. So one thing to note is that when you are at I star, people are going to be choosing mixed strategies in order to stay at that level, unless they find that by switching off their social distancing, you're actually on the way down towards the end of the epidemic. But that means that in this mixed strategy phase, it has to be that infection doesn't change. It keeps stable at level I star. So I can use that to actually characterize what has to be the mixing probabilities that people use. And so it's pretty straightforward. If I doesn't change over time, over an interval of time, is equal to I star, that means that I dot has to be equal to 0. But that means I can actually solve for the epsilon here and figure out this is aggregate exposure. And I can then figure out what does aggregate exposure need to be in order for this bracket to be equal to 0. And this is just showing how you aggregate individual exposure decisions into aggregate exposure decisions. So what you can see is that in a symmetric equilibrium, it must be that epsilon is equal to gamma over beta s, because then it's I dot is equal to 0, and that gives us exactly the mixing probabilities. So the interesting thing to note here is that the exposure that people choose in the social distancing phase is actually a function of the number of S people that are left in the population. And so graphically, so this is just for specific numbers, I've plotted in here. On the x-axis, we have time. And what I've plotted here on the y-axis is the number of infected people. And the dotted line here is the number of infected people in a purely biological model, so without any behavior. Now, the red line here is what I call the exposure level, right? So this is epsilon I t for each individual. So at the beginning of the epidemic, infection is relatively low, it's below I star. And so what happens is that for those levels of infection, people choose not to socially distance. We can see that by the red line being equal to 1 over this time interval. So this is the level 1, it means full exposure. And until I star is reached, there's no difference between the biological and the economic models. Once you reach I star, what happens is that people are going to start to socially distance themselves. And the way this is modeled, it means there's going to be a scaling back of exposure down to some level here, which is not 0. And this is what I kind of emphasized earlier, that your exposure is never 0 in equilibrium. It's always some positive value. Now, what happens is that at this point, people are going to start mixing, use their mixed strategies. And so they're going to mix between full exposure and full protection. And they're going to do that with a probability, a weight, which is a function of the susceptibles, which is what I showed here. Okay, so what you can see here is that because S decreases over time, the weight on full exposure is increasing over time, and at some point it reaches the level 1, and we're back in the world with no social distancing. Now, in terms of the evolution of the infectious disease, in equilibrium, you can see that as soon as we hit the barrier where there's social distancing, there's no further increase in infection. So in equilibrium, basically, infection stays at the level I star until that is a point in time at which people stop socially distancing, and at that point, infection is going to decrease on its own. So this is I don't have time to explain the deep details of this, but the point at which people choose full exposure coincides with the point at which the disease would naturally decrease even in the absence of further social distancing. If that were not the case, that is, if individuals by not socially distancing themselves would cause an increase in infection, then people would switch off exposure again and basically bring back infection to this level. And so they would have stopped in some sense too soon. Okay, so this is, Fabio, yes?
I have a question, but it's very basic. Now, I guess here there's no heterogeneity in the cost in the simple formulation, correct?
I have that extension at the end of the slides. Yeah, that's right.
Because the first because maybe people don't like mixed strategy equilibrium. It's natural to think about
so
heterogeneous, and
yeah, that's right. So in the heterogeneous model, in some sense,
is it equally tractable?
Yes, it's very simple. So basically, there's a one-to-one function between your personal cost and your critical threshold. So what happens is I'm going to have a continuum of critical thresholds, I star of C, say, if C is the heterogeneity. And so if you have a high cost of social distancing, your critical level is just going to be higher. You're going to be more tolerant because socially distancing for you is going to be very expensive. And so what's going to happen is there's going to be a slow phasing in of the social distancing depending on your personal cost characteristics. So in some sense, it's going to make everything just much smoother. But it raises other issues of free riding, because what happens then is that the early adopters, or the people who are distancing early, they are in some sense helping the late adopters because they're curbing the infection. And so it could be that the high cost guys never actually get to socially distance in that kind of equilibrium. So yes, it is tractable.
May I have another question?
Yes.
Yeah, me too.
So
Nico, go ahead.
No, so sorry, but so the point is, it seems that you have to wait for a while with social distancing before the curve goes down, because you have to wait people to recover and so on and so forth.
Yes.
But the assumption that the cost of social distancing is a flow that is constant, linear in time, it does not really correspond to what is social distancing, right? If you stay at home a long time, especially the economic activity, if you want to include that, the cost should at least be increasing with time. So the question would be, what are the relationship of the parameters of how much the cost should go up compared to the recovery from the disease? This, I think, it would be, to understand whether the model generates.
Yeah. So basically, this entire model is built to be stationary. Everything is stationary because that's what I can deal with. But you're right. What you're basically saying is that maybe for short time, short periods of self-isolation, the cost is approximately linear. But after a month, I might have really had enough, and so it's a different world, right? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right, and tractability is my only real excuse here.
Here it seems that there is a tendency to recover of the society. So to some extent, you can allow for some increase. The question is whether this rate of increase is slow enough compared to the properties of the recovery.
So I basically done the model. You can also see, for example, the recovery rate is gamma. It's also a constant. This is also a heroic assumption, right? I'm basically saying that it's exponentially distributed. Why would that be the case? It could be, that if you're infected, you've already been infected 4 days, you're much more likely going forward to be to recover quicker rather than later, right? So you're absolutely right, and this may be what people thought of early in the epidemic. I don't know if you followed the British case, but one of the things that came out early on by the Imperial report was that people had this fatigue, and so there was a limit to how much you would expect people to socially distance, and so there's kind of like a scarce resource, and you want to time it carefully so that you get as much bang for the buck as possible. So this is an issue that I can't model within, well, I might be able to model it, but it's one I haven't modeled. But yes.
Thank you.
Flavio, so I had a question which is, so what happened when you're not sure about your status? If there is imperfect information about either, maybe you don't have this disease, or maybe you
this is great.
Don't know if you have this disease.
So this is great because I have my last 5-6 slides are exactly on this case. Okay, so let me get to that. Okay. So just to give you the overall picture, so here we have basically all the S, I, and R dynamics in this model. You can see that in the dotted lines are the biological models, the solid lines are the economic model. So because the infection basically is curbed at this level I star, then you can also see there's a corresponding change in the dynamics of the other people. So for example, susceptible people, rather than decrease very, very fast, as would have been the case in the uncontrolled model, they decrease much more slowly because they are basically not infected at the same rate. And similarly, the recovered people, they recover much more slowly. And that's simply because there are fewer people infected, and therefore there are fewer people that can recover. So the interesting thing about the economic model is that the tolerance level I star is a function of the parameters, of the preference parameters, and of the biological parameters. And that means that we can actually ask questions that we could not ask in the biological models. We can ask, for example, what would change if the disease becomes worse, or if it becomes more unpleasant, and so forth. And it turns out that there are some quite stark differences between the economic model and the biological model in terms of those predictions. So let's get to those. So the first thing to note is that in a very trivial sense, in the biological model, the disease prevalence is going to be much higher than it would be in the economic model. So here I've just shown you I upper bar is what is called the peak prevalence in the biological model. So that's the highest number of infected people that you will ever reach at a moment in time. Peak prevalence in the economic model is given by this level I star. So the first thing to note is that in the economic model, you flatten the curve. That is, you make the peak prevalence less severe, but, and this is kind of interesting, you also spread the disease out more over time. So in some sense, everybody has talked about how, we want to reduce peak prevalence because the healthcare sector can't deal with a very high number of cases at a given point in time. It could equally be that there are other parts of the economy that would suffer by prolonged levels of elevated infection. So for example, suppose we had a rule of thumb that we always close schools whenever infection is above 5% of the population. Well, in that case, those kinds of costs would be much, much lower with a sharp peak in infection like this, and they would be much, much higher if we have very prolonged levels, prolonged periods with elevated infection levels, as would be the case in the economic model. But more to the point, let's try to see to do some comparative statics of the model with respect to some of the parameters. So I want to give you two examples. I want to give you an example with respect to...
Can I ask a clarification question? I'm not quite understanding, and probably I missed something when you presented the decision problem of the agents. It would seem to me that the decision of whether to socialize the epsilon should depend only on the amount of infection that there is in the population. No, what else matters? I mean,
no,
because
yes and no.
What I am evaluating is the probability of getting infected.
That's right.
But then that depends only on the amount of infected people in the population.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So it is correct. The key parameter here for you is your probability of becoming infected.
Exactly.
But the threshold you use to figure out when it becomes intolerable, that threshold is called I star, and that is a function of all the parameters. So what you're comparing the infection probability with, that is itself endogenous and depends on the parameters. So it's correct. You're always asking, is infection now too high or too low relative to my tolerance? But what the benchmark you use to make that decision, that is a function of the parameters.
the tolerance, I mean.
Exactly. Your tolerance depends on the...
Yeah. But then this tolerance is relative to the infection rate.
Well, no. The tolerance is a benchmark that you impose on the infection rate. Yes.
Okay. So
you're asking basically. So you're basically asking yourself, is this higher or lower infection probability that I'm willing to tolerate? Now, in order to answer that question, you have to say, well, what is the cutoff level at which my tolerance becomes, it is above my tolerance? And that cutoff rate, that is a function of all the preference parameters.
Okay, I think about it. Thank you.
Okay, so let me give you an example of a comparative static that exists in both models and then one that does not. So let's look at what happens when you change beta, which is the infectiousness of the disease. So suppose you were to increase beta. So that means this is an infectious disease that is now more dangerous than it otherwise would have been. So if you look at the purely biological model, when you increase beta, what happens is that peak prevalence increases, as you would expect. So it's a more infectious disease. That means if there's no behavior, more people are going to end up being infected, and therefore peak prevalence is going to be higher. Now, if you look at the economic model, we have to look at the comparative static of I star with respect to beta. And you can see here that it's negative. So that means that in the economic model, when the infectious disease becomes more dangerous, that is, it is more infectious, what happens is that people are going to be less tolerant of the risks involved in exposure. And what's going to happen is that they're going to start socially distancing themselves earlier than would have been the case with a less infectious disease. And so what happens here is that because of the behavior, the comparative static on disease, on peak prevalence, is exactly the opposite in the biological model and in the economic model. So the behavior basically turns on its head the effect of increase in one of the biological model parameters, and the same thing with gamma. So maybe if you will allow me a metaphor, if you were to ask, where do people drown the most often? Do they drown more often close to the beach, or do they drown more often, let's say, 10 kilometers out to sea? And you might think in a naive way, well, 10 kilometers out to sea is much, much deeper, and therefore there should be many more people drowning out there than close to the beaches. But of course, that's holding fixed the behavior of people. We know that most people think it's too dangerous to go far out, and therefore they stay close to the beaches, and therefore just because there are many more people there, there's going to be also more drowning people. So in some sense, the naive way of looking at the dangers of something and just extrapolate from the number of infections to the number of infections is somewhat misleading, because we have to control for the behavior that is itself, of course, a function of the risks involved in the situation. So this is a comparative static with respect to a biological parameter. Let's take another one, which does not exist in the biological model. For example, let's look at a change in pi I. So in pi I is basically the welfare level per instant that an infected individual earns. So that means when pi I is reduced, that means the infection is just more unpleasant than it used to be. Now, if you look at the comparative statics from the biological model, we'll see that, of course, there are zeros all the way over in all the preference parameters. Of course, whether the infection is unpleasant or not unpleasant plays no role in the purely biological model, because there's no behavior. The only thing that matters there is infection and recovery rates. Now, in the economic model, because this threshold I star is a function of the preference parameters, we can then say that when you decrease pi I, that means that the infection becomes more unpleasant. That means that individuals are going to do more in order to protect themselves against the infection, because they don't want that low, this low welfare that is associated with being infected. And so you can see here that in the benchmark case, the equilibrium was the solid black line. And what's going to happen once we make the infection more unpleasant is that social distancing is going to kick in earlier. That is, it's going to kick in at this level down here that I haven't marked. And therefore, the path of the infectious disease is going to follow the solid blue line rather than the solid black line. And so what happens in effect is that because people protect themselves more, then we're going to have a lower disease prevalence, but also by the same token, we're going to spread the disease out more than otherwise would have been the case. Okay, so now let me see how I've lost a bit track of time because we started later than I expected. Could you tell me how much time I have left?
23 minutes.
3 minutes?
23 minutes.
20. Okay, perfect. So let me just tell you one thing about social optimum in this model, and then I will go to the case of asymptomatic infection then. So you might ask, is this equilibrium socially optimal? So the first takeaway point is that the equilibrium, this equilibrium social distancing is going to make the overall outcomes in the economic model much, much better than one would have expected if you were to base your analysis exclusively on a biological model. So as I've shown you, people will spontaneously socially distance themselves, just because out of pure self-interest, and that's going to curb infection, and using this modern term, it's going to flatten the curve. And so maybe we shouldn't be so despondent in thinking about what could happen if we were not to intervene. It turns out that this might be a slightly too optimistic, because in general, in this class of models, social welfare is not maximized in the equilibrium. And the reason is a very straightforward one, which is that in this class of models, typically people will not internalize the externalities that their decisions have on third parties. So in particular, when I choose whether or not to socially distance myself or my household, then I only take my own costs and benefits into account. I don't factor in the possibility that by exposing myself to infection, I might get infected, and therefore I might also infect my neighbor or somebody at the supermarket tomorrow, and so forth. Now, a social planner, of course, would take all those things into account, and therefore a social planner would want there to be more social distancing earlier, and also for an even longer period of time that would happen under the purely decentralized equilibrium. So just to emphasize, social planner would want there to be more stringent measures. They would start earlier, and they would also be in place for longer than would be the case under a decentralized equilibrium. So there are like kind of two messages. Equilibrium, decentralized equilibrium, is much better than the biological model, but is not quite good enough relative to a benchmark of social welfare maximization. So this is these are kind of the two big points I want to make in that regard. Okay, so let's look at asymptomatic infection. So as somebody mentioned, we know that for COVID-19, the so-called asymptomatic ratio is possibly extremely high. So there's a website in Oxford that collects information of existing studies. To date, there's 21 different studies trying to ascertain what is the ratio of asymptomatic people of the ones that are actually infected. And the studies range from 4 to 80% of infected individuals. I don't think that when the history books are written, we will be quite this broader range, but I think most of the studies, they have something around 20 to 40% of infected individuals are asymptomatic. So this creates, of course, a very interesting situation, because many people get infected without knowing it, and therefore that might change people's behavior. We want to understand how does that change equilibrium behavior in this kind of model. Okay. Now, before I go into the details, let me just show you that there are two effects. Yes.
Can I pause it for a second? So
sure.
When they talk about asymptomatic, they mean actually without symptoms? Because there's also a question, some people have symptoms, but just don't know that the symptoms are the disease.
You're of course right. So there's a whole spectrum there. There are two kinds. In principle, there are some that actually feel no symptoms, but there are others that feel extremely mild symptoms, and therefore they basically, if they didn't know that COVID existed, they would probably have thought it was the common cold, or they were just a bit tired. So for my purposes, I'm going to make the assumption that, if you have symptoms of COVID, you know that is that. Those are really bad. But you, of course, in reality, there's a whole range of possible symptoms that once you are attuned to the fact that COVID-19 exists, you might be more prepared to attribute them to that disease. But there are many people who just feel, somewhat uncomfortable, or they feel a bit tired for a few days, and then it turned out that they were sick. Okay? So,
Flavio, so the other question is whether these asymptomatic people are infectious. They can infect other people, correct?
They can. They can.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, I think there are different. According to some, depending on the medical literature is mixed on that, correct?
Yes. So
much less infectious for one thing, typically.
So there typically so there are two kinds of asymptomaticity. There's the one where you never get you never show symptoms. That's the one I'm going to model. And there's an alternative, which is basically to extend the model to an SEIR. So that means you do a state that is between susceptible and infected, which is the exposed period. And that's a situation where you have been infected and you are infectious to other people, but you still haven't shown symptoms. And typically what modelers do is they assume that there's a reduced level of infectiousness. So basically you have 2 levels of beta. You have beta, which is the fully fledged infectiousness while infected. And then there's a reduced, say, mu times beta in the intervening period between exposure and full infection. So there are all sorts of little things that are not fully understood yet. So the way I'm going to...
But I mean, empirically, we also, there are a wide range of estimates on how infectious asymptomatic people can be.
You're absolutely right. And in my model, I basically, I just completely ignore all this stuff, and I assume that everybody knows the parameters of the model. So you're absolutely right.
But in your model, asymptomatic people are infectious. You're taking that
yes.
stand. Or,
yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just to clarify, I was just asking that.
So let me show you what the model looks like. So I'm not going to have time to do any testing. So the model is very simple. I'm going to basically extend the model by assuming that there's a fraction of the population, alpha, which are the ones I call asymptomatic. And you can think of them as 2 ways. There's just an alpha proportion of the population that are born that way and just have a physical makeup that means that they will never going to show symptoms. And they will also not know once they've recovered that they were in fact infected unless they take a test. So that's one interpretation. If you don't like that, then an alternative interpretation that is identical mathematically is that everybody's homogeneous ex ante, but once you become infected, if you become infected, then you draw one of 2 strains, a symptomatic strain or an asymptomatic strain with probability alpha 1 minus alpha. So that's going to be the basic assumptions. And you can see that the way I've drawn it down here in the diagram, there's going to be for any number of infected people, say, there's going to be a fraction alpha 1 minus alpha that is asymptomatic or symptomatic respectively. And once those recover, you're going to have them here as well. There's going to be some people that knew they were infected. That's the 1 minus alpha. And the ones alpha here, down here, they recovered and they still are not any wiser for having recovered. So that's the model. Now, what that's going to do basically is it's going to partition the population into 6 compartments rather than 3 compartments. So, for example, susceptible people, and now there can be 2 kinds of those, and these are the ratios, and infected and recovered people likewise. So we're going to have all of these different compartments. Now, the important thing is that I'm going to assume that people know the population frequencies. Everybody understands the model. That is, they know the SIR equations. They also know alpha. What they do not know is whether they themselves are currently either susceptible, in which case, of course, you don't show symptoms, or you're one of those people who are just happen to have become infected or recovered, but you were those people that were asymptomatic. So that means now there's going to be an inference problem for an individual. You don't know, so conditional on not having shown any symptoms, you are trying to maximize your own well-being, but trying to make inference about which type you are, okay? So let me show you how these beliefs are formed. So I'm going to assume, just for the sake of argument, that alpha is equal to 1/3. That means there's going to be 1/3 of people who become infected that will never show symptoms. And so this dotted line here in the middle, that's the S equation. That's the susceptible people that decreases over time, as we've seen earlier. Now, of those, you can see when we start up, almost everyone is susceptible. So therefore, this curve starts at 1. There's going to be 1/3 of them, this is the lower third, that are susceptible, but they are asymptomatic in the sense that they will never show symptoms, even if they were to become infected. The 2/3 are these guys in the middle. Those are going to be susceptible people that are not infected yet, but importantly, if they were to become infected, they would then show symptoms. Okay, now up here, we have the people, so everyone who is above this curve are people who are not susceptible. That is, they're either they're either infected or recovered. And of those, again, we're going to have 1/3 that are not showing symptoms and will never show symptoms, and 2/3 that will show symptoms as soon as they're infected. And of course, that information is carried over to the recovery, so they know they have been infected. Now, why is this important? This is important because you, as an individual, you're only going to protect yourself if you happen to be in this group here. That is, you're susceptible, so you could potentially become infected, but you're also those guys that become symptomatic. So in this model, if you don't show any symptoms whatsoever, then you're basically a lucky person who doesn't care about becoming infected. So if you knew you were susceptible, but you were one of those guys that were never going to show any symptoms, in my model, you wouldn't want to protect yourself, because the only reason you want to protect yourself is to avoid negative symptoms, that is a decrease in your welfare because of the infection. Okay.
But so how would I know whether, in practice, people don't know whether they're asymptomatic or not?
You won't know, and that's the whole problem here. So this is what, so that's exactly right. So you don't know, you can't distinguish, so conditional on not having ever shown symptoms, you can't distinguish between any of the gray areas. You have to make inference about which area you are in as the disease progresses. So what happens is that early on in the epidemic, you know that almost everyone is susceptible. So if you haven't shown any symptoms, you're almost certain to be somewhere here, because nobody has been infected yet. Now, what happens is over time, because you understand that some people are now becoming infected. By the way, I haven't put any behavior yet. This is purely updating at this point. Over time, as more and more infected people have been created, you observe people become infected and recovering. That's the white people here. As time goes on, the probability that you are in the susceptible class and in any of the subsets here becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And the probability...
I was just asking about the assumption, if I am an asymptomatic guy,
yes.
I don't know whether I'm a symptomatic guy.
No.
I don't know whether if I were to get the disease, I would be asymptomatic. Like in practice, exactly. I don't know it.
Exactly. So you don't know.
Take a picture of the model. You assume that I don't know whether exactly.
Yes.
Which is really
yes.
So you initially said instead that only those people in the previous slide. That's why I didn't understand. If you go back to the previous slide, you said if you are a susceptible asymptomatic, you don't have the next one, next slide. The one with the first one with the picture. Yeah, the next after exactly this one. Yes, the one before. Here, stop. Exactly here. You say if you're susceptible asymptomatic,
yes,
you still will take precaution, correct? If you go for the behavioral model.
Exactly. You don't know whether you're one of those two.
Exactly.
Yeah. So
okay, but you said I knew. Okay, fine, exactly. Yeah. So I just misunderstood something you said.
That's fine. So what happens here is that if after, let's say, 15 periods, I still haven't experienced any symptoms, I will now assign a very large probability to have been asymptomatic, whereas a very low probability to being susceptible. Whereas at the early stages of the epidemic, I will assign a higher probability to be susceptible than to being asymptomatic. So you can see that as the epidemic increases over time, what's going to happen is that I'm going to start becoming increasingly pessimistic about me being still at risk. Okay, and this has a name in the literature. I'm going to skip this stuff because I think we will run out of time. So this is called fatalism. So let me show you these three graphs, and I think these nicely encapsulate what is going on here. This line here, it looks very much like the S curve, but actually it's something I call sigma, which is the conditional probability of being potentially symptomatic, but still susceptible. So you can think of that as a perceived personal susceptibility. So this basically, you can see that it decreases over time. As time progresses, if I haven't observed any symptoms, I think it is less and less likely that I'm actually at risk. What I have here in the middle, the dotted line, is what I call the force of infection. So the force of infection is let's see where I have that, sorry. The force of infection is, okay, is beta times I. So you can think of the force of infection as being the risk of being infected by an infected person if you were susceptible. And you can see that, of course, that has exactly the same pattern as the I equation has in the biological model. But the interesting thing is the perceived risk. So the perceived risk here multiplies. So now I can show you on the previous slide. Down here in the last equation, I basically have 1 minus alpha is the probability that I am potentially symptomatic. Sigma is this perceived susceptibility. That's the conditional probability of being susceptible, conditional on not having observed any symptoms. And this I multiply with the beta times I, which is the force of infection. This is basically the risk of having potentially negative consequences of having become infected. And if you see here on the plotted on this solid line, this is non-monotone. So basically that means that as time goes on, I become more and more fatalistic. I basically resign myself to the idea that most likely I'm going to have already become infected. I just didn't notice it, and then I'm no longer at risk. So I can tell you from introspection that this is something that happens. My own daughter had very likely had coronavirus 3-4 weeks ago, and I never showed any symptoms. I assume that because I lived in the same household, I'm extremely likely to have already been infected, but just not noticing it. And I hope now, of course, I'm immune. But this is what it works like in the model. Now, this is just...
Sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Professor. Just one question.
Yes, please.
So I'm Gunj. I'm a PhD student here. Nice to meet you. And regarding the perceived susceptibility, so should it matter how I am behaving as time goes on? So if I am staying completely isolated, I can still think that I am susceptible even though a lot of time has gone by.
Yes. So you're absolutely right. So in this model, I've exploited the fact that the population is homogeneous, and because the population is homogeneous, everybody's in a symmetric equilibrium. Everybody's going to behave the same, and because everybody behaves the same, I can use the population frequencies to make inferences about my likely infectious status. So you're absolutely right. If I were to have different classes of individuals that were of different, have different makeup and therefore behaved differently in equilibrium, then I would have to keep track of individual history in order to make inference about a given individual. So I don't think so solving for the best response in that case is a trivial extension. So I can do that. What I would probably have a little more difficulty is to characterize the equilibrium, because now I have to basically keep track of a whole distribution of beliefs. So I'm not saying it's not feasible. I'm just saying I haven't actually thought about how to do that. But the updating in some sense would be very similar to this, but I would just have to correct for my own personal history of exposure.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Okay, so how does this translate into equilibrium behavior? So this is still very much work in progress, but I have done a little bit of progress. Basically, what's going to happen in this model is that there's going to be a threshold, I star, just like in the complete information model, but it's going to be modified by these beliefs, sigma, and sigma, I should probably go back and show you, sigma is going to be a function of the number of people in the population, S and R. So this is the frequency of potentially symptomatic, susceptible people in the whole population of people who have not shown any symptoms until this point. So this is what this is. And that is going to basically show up in the tolerance equation, I star. So what's going to happen here is that as the infection progresses, people are going to be updating their beliefs about how likely they are to be still infected. And therefore, it's going to change their tolerance to additional exposure. In particular, what's going to happen is that I star is now going to be increasing over time. And the intuition is very straightforward. At the beginning of this game, you're very, very unlikely to be infected. and therefore you are very, very demanding in terms of the critical threshold. You're going to protect yourself at a relatively low level of I star. Over time, as you become fatalistic, you become more and more convinced that you're no longer at risk, because you most likely have already gotten infected and recovered, and therefore there is no additional infection probability in this model. Then you're going to basically be less and less picky about when to expose yourself socially. And that is basically how I star increases over time. Now, what does that have of consequences on the aggregate? Well, what is going to happen here is that there's going to be less social distancing because of this asymptomatic infection. And because there's less social distancing, there's going to be more exposure. And by the nature of things, that means there's going to be also more infected people. So there's going to be more infection in the model, whether you don't know whether or not people are infectious or not. Now, one thing that is very, very important to note here, that the reason that there's more infection is not the one you might originally have thought. So let me just tell you what one could have thought. One could have thought that in this model, if you don't know who is infected, so you don't know who is susceptible, who is infectious and who is not infectious, then you're more likely to run into infected people. In some sense, you can't avoid them. Now, in this model, this is not really the mechanism, because if you can correctly specify what the risks are, then of course you take precautions. Now, what happens here is there's going to be more infected people because people protect themselves less than they otherwise would have. So it's actually because of people's own behavior that there's going to be more infection. It's not because the asymptomaticity makes it more difficult to avoid people. And now, in terms of social welfare, it is not clear whether it is worse to be in the perfect information case or in the asymptomatic case, because remember, in this model, if you're always asymptomatic, in some sense, you care about the disease less than you otherwise would have. And in fact, I can show that this setting I've just shown you perfectly nests two different extremes. When alpha is equal to 0, that means you're back in the standard model that I showed you earlier. And when alpha is equal to 1, that means everybody's asymptomatic, then nobody cares about anything, they never socially distance, and you're basically back in the purely biological model. Okay, so that's, I think that's it. I see people have been chatting to me. I don't know whether, okay.
So we have like 1 minute, if you could wrap it up. Yeah.
Of course. So let me just go back very quickly and just show you some things that I did not do. So the first thing is nonlinear costs. As I mentioned earlier, the idea is very similar. You basically, if you have nonlinear costs, instead of having this shift from 0 to an interior solution, you'll have a smooth transition where people say stay in somewhat more than usual, and then little by little they ramp up their social distancing. The nice thing about my model is that I can actually get closed form solutions for the equilibrium along the entire equilibrium path. That wouldn't be the case in the nonlinear cost case, but of course I can just simulate it. But the big picture here is not going to change because of that. Heterogeneity, I also mentioned, once you have heterogeneity, you can basically show that there's going to be a one-to-one correspondence between your own personal cost parameter and your willingness to expose yourself. And what you can have in this situation is then you can have people free riding on the social distancing decision of other people. So I think this is as far as we can take it now. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Any good question?
Can I ask you a question? So the model I think is very nice in showing what sort of different situations can arise depending on the parameters, the assumptions, etc. But it is unclear to me if you take it from a positive viewpoint, that would be this one, to a normative one. Okay, what from the point of view of policy?
Yeah.
What sort of policy recommendations or measures that are realistic does your model suggest?
So remember, there are two things. First of all, I've been very black box about what exactly are the payoff consequences of becoming infected. I've just taken a view that this is just personal discomfort, but I haven't modeled any disruptions that my absence from the economy could have to the wider economy. So for that kind of analysis, if you want a detailed analysis, you would probably have to build out with a more specific model of, say, if you want to look at what would be the effects on the macroeconomy and so on. The second thing I have ignored in this model, and I think it's an important one, and I'm working on this already, is to take, rather than having a homogeneous model where everybody's the same and the contact rates are homogeneous, to have one with social structure. So not everyone knows the same number of people. There is well known that there are some people that have more friends, they have more exposed positions. Children are famous for being super exposed to infection because they meet other children and so on. So I think if we wanted to know, for example, from a social perspective, who would we like to isolate? What are the nodes or the individuals we would like to socially distance more? Then we have to be explicit about what is the social structure we have in mind. So this is also something I haven't ignored here. So in terms of policy conclusion based on this model, the main policy conclusion is that equilibrium is going to be socially inefficient, and the social planner would want there to be more social distancing than would otherwise be the case. Now, one thing that would be nice to do, and I think I had that in the conclusion page, is to look at what would happen in situations where you have interaction between, no, I didn't make it to the slide. What would happen when you have interaction between decentralized decision-making by individuals and policy that is imposed by a central planner? So that is not a situation where everybody does what the social planner wants them to do, not the situation where everybody does what they want to do, but the interaction between policy interventions and decentralized decision-making. You can think of that as a theory of the second best.
Okay.
Okay, so let's thank Flavio for his presentation.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
And thanks for all your questions. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Flavio.